Okay, so good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for joining this event. So this is part of the UK CEiRSI webinar series, and we welcome you to the UK Centre of Excellence on In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation, or UK CEiRSI for short, where we provide training webinars that are proudly supported by Innovate UK, the Medical Research Council, and is sponsored by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agents, or MHRA, in the UK. As the UK's first centre on its kind, we pioneer the use of in-silico methods to enhance regulatory science and innovation. And our webinars will delve into the latest advancements, best practices, and applications of in-silico approaches, fostering collaboration, discussion, and knowledge sharing amongst stakeholders that drive progress in healthcare and medical research. And we hope that you join us to explore the future of regulatory science. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to René Bombien, who is going to introduce the particular webinar of today and the other colleagues and speakers that are going to be with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this introduction. Also for me, a warm welcome to this webinar. The title we have today is Bridging Virtual and Clinical, Stakeholder Insights on Computational Modeling and Simulation in Medical Device Regulation. I have four brilliant speakers with me here. We will go on different topics, so we are all from different areas. We are from regulatory, we are from science, we are from notified bodies and consulting. We are going to have 5 presentations today, each about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussions later. And then I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Marta de Cunha Maluf-Burgman. And maybe, Marta, you would also like to introduce yourself quickly. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I hope that you can hear me well and you can see my slides, correct?
Yeah, we can hear you and we see your slides. So.
Perfect, thank you. Well, thank you for having me today and give me the opportunity to present today in this training webinar. My name is Marta de Cunha Maluf-Burgman. I'm the Policy Development and Working Group leader from Avicenna Alliance, and also I'm Director of Regulatory Affairs from Edwards Life Sciences, but today I'm representing Avicenna. But I would like to start my presentation today with mentioning a work from the Society for Clinical Data Management, who is focused on data-driven technologies that may give value to clinical data. And they are talking also about the 5 V's of clinical data, meaning volume, variety, velocity, veracity, and value. They say that to successfully move from the current clinical data management to next generation of clinical data science paradigms, the way we collect, interact with, and gain insights from different subsets of data must evolve. Ultimately, technologies must support the implementation of emerging data strategies and enable the aggregation, integration, and interpretation of high volumes of data continually generated from many sources with complex data structures. Clinical data management must also derive relevant secondary data assets to extract the full value of our data. Here's where computational modeling and simulation, digital twins, and synthetic data play an important role to generate a speed of innovation, where the 5 V's can be combined with the 3 R's of the in-silico technologies. As you may remember, replace, that is defined as the use of computational modeling and simulations to replace physical testing or animal studies where possible. As an example, instead of conducting early-stage animal trials, Virtual simulations can model device-tissue interactions or predict pharmacokinetics in silico. Reduce is the second R, which definition is to minimize the number of physical experiments or animal subjects needed by using simulation to narrow down tests conditions. As an example, we have simulations that can identify worst case scenarios or optimal parameters, reducing the number of physical prototypes or tests ground required. The third R is the refine, which definition is to improve the quality and precision of experiments by using computational modeling and simulation to better design and target them. As an example, we use simulations that can help refine surgical technologies or techniques or define placement strategies before clinical trials, enhancing safety and efficacy, and especially safety for the patients. These principles align with ethical and scientific goals in biomechanical research and are widely referenced in regulatory guidance, including, for example, the FDA and ASME, to promote responsible and efficient use of modeling in medical device development and clinical research. So now I would like to talk on a brief introduction of computational modeling and simulation in clinical context. So we have a definition of computational modeling and simulation that refers to the use of computational tools to simulate biological systems, disease progression, and medical device interactions. In Avicenna Alliance, we have our own glossary. You can see the link here that defines computational modeling in simulation as the use of mathematics, physics, and computer science to create numerical representations of real-world or conceptual systems that can be used, for example, to reduce, refine, or replace experimental and clinical research. Remember, the 3 R's are very important for us. The purpose is to augment or replace traditional clinical and experimental methods by generating virtual evidence. And the scope includes in-silico clinical trials, digital twins, and virtual patient cohorts. Sorry. Now I would like to talk about a strategic value of computational modeling and simulation generated clinical data. So in silico data. The strategic value for us has two sides on the coin. One is the regulatory impact, that is the support of FDA or other competent authorities in submissions with virtual evidence, potentially reducing the need for human trials, and aligns with ASME BMB40 standards for model credibility. And then we have the other side of the coin, that is the clinical trial optimization, which enables virtual prototyping and pre-screening of device performance and reduces trial size and duration by simulating outcomes. What is the operational and economic benefits for computational modeling and simulation in clinical development? So we can talk about on cost efficiency, which is reduced reliance on costly and time-consuming in vivo studies, in time to market, which is accelerates product development cycles through early design validation, like in silico trials, and risk reduction by identifying potential safety issues before clinical development. What is the scientific and clinical insights for us? Or what are them? We have mechanistic understanding that tell us that provides detailed insights into physiological responses and device interactions. And then we can use computational modeling and simulation for personalized medicine, which enables simulation of individual patients' anatomies and physiologies and responses. Example, the virtual patient cohorts. And then we can use computational modeling and simulation for decision support, which is enhanced clinical decision-making with predictive modeling. We can see now some use cases and applications. First, we can talk about predictive patient outcomes post-deployment of an implantable medical device using virtual patients modeling, like implantable ICDs, right? Then we can talk about evaluating performance differences in device generation, even when we want to perfectionate or to do next generation of the same device in our companies. And then we can talk also on using machine learning to detect conditions and personalize treatments for patients. In-Silico trial of breast cancer imaging technologies is another application, where the objective is to evaluate the performance of imaging technologies for breast cancer detection. What is the approach? Is to simulate virtual patient populations with varying breast densities and tumor characteristics. And what will be the outcome? Is to enable comparative effectiveness studies without exposing real patients to radiation or requiring large-scale clinical trials. Another example is the digital twins for heart failure analysis, where the objective is to assess patient-specific cardiac functions and predict outcomes of therapeutic interventions. What will be the approach? Is to create digital replicas of individual patients' hearts using imaging and physiological data. And the outcome is to support personalized treatment planning and risk stratification in heart failure management. Another example that is very well known by our host here, Alex Frangi, is the In-Silico trials. Yes?
I think we may have lost the slides, the sharing of the screen, no?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Do you see my screens now?
Yes, it was still the light bulb, right?
Yeah. Yes. So the third example that I wanted to talk is about the In-Silico trial of flow diverter for intracranial aneurysm that Alex knows very well, which objective was to evaluate the safety and efficacy of flow diverter devices used to treat brain aneurysms. He uses the approach by simulated blood flow dynamics and device tissue interactions across virtual patient anatomies. And the outcomes is well known by all of us, is to provide evidence for regulatory submissions and reduce reliance on animal testing. And other examples we have on the FDA endorsed applications of computational modeling and simulation. And among them, we can mention modeling of drug device combination products to predict drug release profiles, simulation of orthopedic implants wear and tears over time, and virtual testing of ventilator performance under various patient conditions. This was a very important computational modeling during COVID time, for example. The impact for these models have been used to support pre-market submissions and post-market surveillance. Broader clinical applications identified in literature can be disease modeling For example, simulating disease progression in conditions like cancer, diabetes, and neurodegenerative disorders, or surgical planning by using patient-specific models to optimize surgical approaches and predict outcomes, or drug development, as we mentioned before, modeling pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics to inform dosing strategies and reduce trial sizes. What are the challenges and considerations here? So we have 3 model challenges. One is the model credibility, which requires a rigorous verification and validation processes in the in-silico models. And then we have the challenge of the regulatory acceptance, where the competent authorities must align with or must see that the companies providing the in-silico data are aligning with the standards and guidances like the standards from or guidance from FDA, ASB, ISO, or EEC. And then the data integration, which needs harmonization of clinical imaging and simulation data. Here, data interoperability is of high importance on data sharing factors to produce very good studies in our industry. To conclude and to breathe a little bit, we'd like to talk about the future outlook of computational modeling in simulation. So, and to talk about the future outlook, we talk about 2 vectors. One vector is on the transformation, where clinical data and transformation can be exposed as a computational modeling and simulation is transforming clinical data generation by offering scalable, ethical, and efficient alternatives to traditional trials. And the other vector on investment is the continued investment in model validation, regulatory alignment, and interdisciplinary collaboration, which is key to unlocking its full potential. So, and as life is simple, those were my simple thoughts and my simple drawing expressing thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marta. We will wait with the questions for the end, I think, right? Or shall we? Yeah, we'll do that. Okay. Thank you, Marta, again for your presentation. That was great. Now I would like to welcome Erika Beaucage-Gauvreau. She's going to talk about science and CM&S, the creation of the basis for clinical data. Erika, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my slides and hear me?
Yes, we can see your slides and hear you too.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you. I am the manager of IC Health, which is the KU Leuven Institute of In-Silico Modeling for Health. So basically, we are an umbrella organization within KU Leuven, and we unite the different researchers focusing on in-silico modeling, the different aspects of in-silico modeling, to ultimately accelerate the clinical implementation of in-silico modeling. And today I'll take that point of view to talk about science and computational modeling and simulation, the creation of the basis for clinical data. So recently there was the RAPS conference last month in Brussels that was looking at considering regulatory science in computational modeling and simulation. I was not there personally, but some of my colleagues were. And we got talking about some of the slides that were presented. In one of the panel on MDR, there was this slide. And what we noticed coming from academia is that are there any stakeholders that are missing in this boat that is meant to accelerate the clinical implementation? So of course, we thought, where is academia? Universities are innovation drivers. And there are many models that are developed within university. And we have many technical experts that come from engineering and technology, basic science research, and medicine, and they collaborate, they do multidisciplinary research to develop these models. But it's true that the critical challenge that are part of the bed-to-bedside trajectory of in-silico health application is not necessarily their strength as academic researchers. So often the regulatory consideration are overlooked or they're treated as an afterthought. Typically or traditionally, it's more the industry, research done in industry that is implementing these principles. So if we look at it from the academic point of view, one of the reasons that maybe why this is the case is because the way of how academia is structured. So often the research done in academia is based on research projects that are time limited. So for a short duration, there will be funding for that project. And the researchers for these projects are often in temporary positions. So they're PhD researchers or postdoc, and they're still developing their expertise while they're doing their research. And one of their main objectives is not necessarily the regulatory consideration, but it's to produce publication related to the knowledge or the new methodology that they develop. And often the interaction with regulatory agency for specific projects would come after these researchers have left academia. And because there is often a turnover, there's sometimes fragmentation in the knowledge transfer between the different researchers. But if we want the research to be relevant in clinics, we need to increase this translational value of in-silico research. So, as I mentioned, often the research within academic is driven by scientific curiosity, methodological innovation. And what might seem simple and logical is not necessarily defined or thought about at the start of the model development. So looking at question of why do we need this model? What is this model for? Who will use it? And in what setting? It's not always that researchers pause and discuss and assess these questions in depth. But that would really help to align the clinical endpoints and the engineering outputs. And a defined scope and understanding the limitation or in what setting the model can be used can definitely support future regulatory success, even when the researchers have moved on. So through education and training activities, it becomes important to familiarize the researchers within academia to these notions. Another point that is important about model is to establish credibility. And again, often researchers in academia want to focus on the scientific outputs and making the most computationally efficient methods. But that alone is not enough to create real-world impact. So we need to have a structured credibility assessment. So one of the framework that has been proposed is the ASME Verification and Validation 40 that has been developed by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And that's been used in recent year as a bit of a guide. So this is a bit the overview of what it looks like, and it's a risk-informed framework. So it's asking the modelers to look at what is the influence of the model on the clinical decision-making and what would be the consequences. So, for example, if the model is just supporting a decision with other clinical routine assessments, so there's already medical imaging and that's just supporting that the model influence is lower. And the decision consequence is if if there is a bad decision, what would be the impact on the patient? So if this could result in severe injury or death, then the risk is high. And in that case, the credibility assessment needs to be higher. And maybe that is one of the reasons why credibility assessment is not as implemented in academic research, because often the research is early stage. So not all researchers will think about the clinical implementation from the start. But nevertheless, it's important to establish credibility for a model and to make sure that we can trust the output. So with any models, there's going to be some errors because we took some assumptions in developing the model, we make some decision, and it's important for the researcher to assess that. So the two main components are verification. So there we're looking at, are there any errors associated with the development of the source code? And are there any numerical approximation errors that affect the output? And the validation is looking at, can we trust the model output? Of course, sometimes that is tricky because models are used to estimate quantities that we cannot measure directly. So for example, if I want to measure spinal loads, I cannot have a model and compare it to real-time data because it's not possible to do that. So that's where uncertainty quantification can be used to evaluate how the uncertainties in the input in the model propagate through the model so that we can have better trust on the output and how that would affect the decision making. Again, through education and training activities, we think it's important for young and senior researchers to incorporate these credibility assessment early on in the development of models. Then another component that is important is computational reproducibility. So as I mentioned, when a model is developed, there'll be several decisions and assumptions that are made when the model is developed. And it's important eventually when this model will be reviewed for the regulatory process that these decisions and the workflows and the results can be traced back so that we can ensure compliance. Another important part of computational reproducibility is data sustainability. So again, we mentioned earlier that projects are often for a short number of years, but it's important to make sure that the data are preserved in a repository. Often nowadays it will be cloud-based, and that the data can be used again by others. And that brings me to my next point also, is to eventually share these data, of course, following the proper regulation, so that the data sets that are produced can be used by others to perform those validation activities. So there's a EU-funded project called Leuven that is currently looking at that, how we can create a sandbox of data for further validation. But again, there are challenges with doing that. Deciding what to keep is hard. Despite being very intelligent researcher, memory is weak and self-discipline is always hard, even with your own result. And checking reproducibility is not easy. So a possible solution is to outsource and eliminate, or at least reduce the hard task through automating storage of computational experiments, and acknowledging that not every researcher needs to be an expert on data management and related tools. And more data management specialists, or they're often called data stewards, can be involved in research group to make sure that this is done properly by a specialist in that area of data. Also, what we saw is that it's important early on to develop a regulatory strategy. So it's important to develop collaboration with regulatory experts, even during the grant planning phase. Not only, it's important to develop partnership not only with industry experts, but also individual within regulatory authorities, so that you can seek advice on the different results and build on established precedents. And another important point is to ensure continuous oversight of research projects. So what that might look like is having a project manager that is there for the entire duration of the project to make sure that all these considerations are taken into account and well documented. Again, also through education and training activities. So in conclusion, we see that it's important to raise awareness about the notion of context of use and credibility assessment, both through training and education, to consider data management and data sustainability, and to involve partners through partnership with industry experts, but also through regulatory agencies so that the models can be brought into clinical implementation. So if we visit back this picture as the start, we see that academia is not always considered a partner, but is that it should be included at the table in the discussion and should be acknowledged as a partner. And that academics also need to understand that eventually, if they want their model to be in implemented in clinics, they have to operate under a regulated environment that perform a benefit risk assessment, of course, potentially sometimes at the expense of academic freedom. So if we look at it as a bit of an analogy, maybe academia is the boat carrying the different stakeholders where many models are developed, and academia is an innovation bed. And the paddles are regulatory science that are uniting the different stakeholders and academia to develop these novel partnerships across the different disciplines. So in recent years, there's been several resources that have been developed mainly for the research community to integrate these regulatory considerations that are becoming very important. So here I've just included a few that have been produced in the last 2 years or last few years that are very important. And also just want to mention this is a bit the idea also around IC Health and why it was created at KU Leuven so that we can collaborate together and advance the clinical implementation of research developed in academia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika, for this great presentation. Totally agree with the boat. Okay, now I would like to introduce Suraj, and he's going to talk about the ethics and the law of clinical data from CM&S. Suraj, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. So hello and or good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. So I'm Suraj. I'm a clinical reviewer at TÜV-SÜD, which is a notified body within the EU. I'm a neurosurgeon by profession previously, and I've got a law degree as well. So I was asked today to talk about the ethical and legal landscape of computational modeling and simulation. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the, oh, there we go. But I will interchangeably use the term In-Silico as well. And In-Silico refers to the silicon in the computer chips for computers, of course. Now, we are going to touch upon both the evolving and current ethical and legal landscapes, but as a caveat, though, I'm only going to touch upon, scrape the surface of this. Because this is actually quite an extensive area, but I'll like to try and see if I can highlight some of the more salient features if I can. So in terms of the ethical landscape, we need to consider all the various stakeholders, which obviously includes not just patients, human patients, but animals as well. We'll go through the methodological and regulatory ethics, as well as manufacturers and public health as well. So in terms of animal testing, well, what are the considerations? Now, for those of you who are as old as I am, will remember straight back to the 1980s when there was a huge amount of publicity over animal testing, and that was driven mainly by the cosmetic industry, of course. And certainly public and media exposure at that stage and the decades that have pursued have certainly helped to put a spotlight on the industry. Now, within the EU, there have been various legislations which have helped change and navigate away from animal testing, including cosmetic regulations and the REACH legislation. But the driver working alongside of this has been the need to source alternative models. So Marta nicely explained the 3 R's. So I'm going to talk about the 3 R's when it comes to the various aspects and how computational modeling for 3 R's can help in these domains. In terms of animal testing, in terms of reduce, it would be to reduce the number of animals involved, hopefully to none. In terms of refine, it would be to refine or minimize the suffering by using computational models instead of animal models. And to replace, and that would be to remove animal testing completely. Now, we do know with animal testing that there can be interspecies differences, whether you're working on primates or rabbits as such. And there's also translational problems of moving from the animal studies to human studies as well. So computational modeling offers the benefit of removing those problems. So let's next consider patients and the ethical considerations here. What we do know is prior to market access, to market placement, trials are still very much experimental with no absolute proven efficacy. Device development, especially high-risk devices, will cause significant potential problems to patients, and high-risk patients in particular being subjected to device development of unknown proven efficacy. Orphan populations have become extremely topical, especially in the EU. And as we know, these are low patient numbers. So again, you're subjecting low patient volumes with potentially high-risk devices and high-risk patients, which is problematic. And we will all, of course, remember the COVID pandemic, but we also need to consider what do we do in pandemics, what do we do in emergencies about trying to bring together medical devices that are safe and effective, but in a speedy time, of course. So then how can computational modeling help overcome those barriers? So let's consider the 3 R's again. Reduce. Number of patients, especially high-risk patients, you can reduce that by using computational modeling instead. The duration number of interventions can be dramatically reduced by using computational simulation. Delays, and we've talked about pandemics already. Theoretically, computational modeling can be used to actually bring devices to the market faster and safer. Refine, well, we've already talked about reducing the number of patients, exposing patients to clinical studies, thereby also reducing unnecessary harm in device development. And then replace, now obviously this is a discussion for many years down the line, but the potential of perhaps totally replacing human clinical trials in the future. So now let's consider the methodological ethical considerations. So at the moment, and for a long time yet, there is a lack of experience by manufacturers and regulators in its application. Then there's the real-world comparison and validity. And that's being able to select the right comparator for the model. So the computation model needs to have a real-world comparator. And there's a lack of availability of that at this stage. And also, we need to be able to cover all the possible endpoints, which again, we still do not necessarily have at this point. Also, we do recognize the fact that human tissue can be affected by disease states to varying degrees, which makes the predictive value of In-Silico rather challenging. Then there are also patient risks, and it's about being able to try and identify all the risks and not just a specific risk that we're feeding into the model. And we also know, anecdotally, that many trials around the world have detected unknown risks. So how would a computational model necessarily predict for that? There are also errors in terms of the data and the software. So incorrect trading of data, software errors can amplify that. And that could potentially only be then picked up in the post-market phase. Then there's inherent complexity of In-Silico methodology. You need special skill sets, specialist software. Then there's the idea, well, could it ever completely replace a clinical trial? Or should every clinical trial have computational modeling done alongside it to minimize risk to patients in the actual trial itself? So let's put the 3 R's in application. So reduce and refine, what can we do? So we can reduce and refine in terms of conducting multiple simulations using In-Silico, therefore assess for safety and performance under a range of different conditions and scenarios. But we can also assess extreme conditions using computational modeling. You could look at surgical variability, patient activity, site-specific variables such as bone quality as well. And then replace. Well, computational modeling could replace animal testing. If we don't have the translatable issues that you have with animal testing, the higher doses, higher risk patient issues that we have with animal testing. And there's also the potential of using it in the post-market phase of the device as well. So in terms of the manufacturer, well, what are the considerations on the manufacturing side? Well, first of all, there's the cost, especially for old legacy devices, such as orphan medical devices. It's expensive keeping those on the market, especially when they only have a very small niche population that they can actually help treat. Then there's the development of In-Silico methodology. That's developing and applying it, getting the specialist personnel in, getting the software licenses, getting the data storage, acquiring relevant clinical data sets for validation purposes. So there's a whole series of steps that must occur first before it actually comes underway. So then how can computational modeling help in terms of the 3 R's? Well, it can reduce the number of patients required, especially for a study. It can reduce the length of time of a study, therefore reduce the cost of study to a manufacturer, and reduce the time it would take to bring a new medical device to the market, as we've discussed already. It can help streamline their pre-market data gathering, but it can also help potentially replace both the pre-market and perhaps in the future the post-market as well. So in terms of public health, well, but there's predictive capacity of computational modeling. So it can help predict hospital factors that help contribute to patient morbidity. It could help identify future disease target areas using public health databases. It can also help identify future medical device developments as well. We've already talked about its potential use in pandemics and emergencies, but there's also a huge benefit here in terms of high risk or low patient number populations and difficulty with patient recruitment. I believe Reddy's going to be talking about orphan devices later on. So in terms of 3 R's, well, how can computational modeling help in terms of public health? So it can reduce the time to market, helpful for pandemics. It can help reduce surgical complications by being able to look at surgical factors that can help reduce complications. And that would also help reduce the cost of healthcare providers, and most importantly, reduce the effect on the patient itself. How can computational modeling help refine? So it can help identify target populations and indications. It can perhaps help identify medical devices suitable that could proceed to clinical development, and perhaps determine unmet healthcare needs based on population disease dynamics. So we've touched upon the ethical consideration for the various stakeholders, but we now need to consider what is actually out there for us to be able to use in terms of a legal landscape. We'll start by looking at what's happening here in the European Union, and then we will discuss a model which is used in the US. So in terms of European Union, we've talked about the drivers, in particular the cosmetic industry. You've got Directive 2010/63, Cosmetics Regulation REACH legislation. There are also 2 other very important European bodies that have helped drive the computational modeling. You've got the European Medicine Agency, which has the Innovation Task Force, and they've produced a couple of guidance documents on PPK and the qualification of novel methodologies of medicine development. But there's also the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety, which advises non-food consumer products, for example, cosmetics. And in their advisory document, they also talk about the use of in-silico data as an alternative option. Now, within the European Union, what is actually out there in terms of legislation? And we have the European Union Medical Device Regulation, which was first published in 2017. And that sets out the requirements that a medical device must have, satisfy safety and performance requirements, which is detailed in Annex 1 of the MDR. However, within the MDR, there are areas which do lend itself to supporting computer modeling generated data. And I'll refer you to Annex 7, paragraph 4.5.4, and I'm just going to read this out if you don't mind. And it states, the planning, conduct, assessment, reporting, and where appropriate, updating of a preclinical evaluation, in particular scientific preclinical literature search, and the preclinical testing, for example, laboratory testing, simulated use testing, computer modeling, and the use of animal models. And then this is further followed up by, if Chapter 1 requirements are met, by the Chapter 2, paragraph 10.1, which states, and I'm going to quote again, where appropriate, the results of biophysical or modeling research, the validity of which has been demonstrated beforehand. So you have two areas here where, even back from 8 years ago now, the MDR did have within its scope the use of computation modeling in MDR applications. So last year, a brilliant guidance document, MCG guidance document, came out on orphan medical devices 2024-10. And in section 6, we discussed the role of non-clinical data. And I'm going to again quote from here, if you don't mind. And it says, data from computer modeling and simulated use testing, including software-based models, 3D printed models, and other physical models. So essentially, we have two areas here. We've got not only the area of legislation in terms of the EU MDR, but we've also got regulatory updates in terms of the orphan medical device document from last year. So what's happening across the pond in the US? Well, they've certainly been a lot more proactive compared to where we are at the EU, and they have produced a number of guidance documents. I'm not going to go through each one individually, but I am going to focus on, and I know Erica has touched on this already, which is the ASME VMV 40. So ASME is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And in 2018, they produced their guidance document, which is assessing credibility of computation modeling through verification and validation application of medical devices. Now, as Erica said, this is a risk-based credibility assessment framework, and it's the premise of foundation upon which computation modeling can be used in FDA submissions. So let's try and simplify this. It is about assessing the credibility of the In-Silico methodology based on the medical device's context of use. And by that, it means define the specific role of that medical device. The next is asking how the In-Silico generated data actually answers the question of interest. Does it meet its intended purpose? To validate the model, the methodology predictions must be compared against known data held for in vitro and vivo work. So this is constantly about validating the computer-generated data against what we already know. And this is where verification and validation is so important. So model verification, which is the VMV part of the ASME, is that the computer model can produce an accurate representation of the intended model or solution that's assessed, which essentially means assessing the correctness of the mathematical model being used. And the model validation is how accurate that model is compared to the real world. So it's these two areas must come hand in hand when it comes to regulatory application. But one thing we do need to be mindful of is it's an international two-tier system being developed, where you have areas such as the US, which will accept computer modulation, and the rest of the world, which doesn't have the same regulatory frameworks. There's a risk here that computation model-derived medical devices could therefore only be marketed in territories which are accepting the data. But there's also equally a risk that manufacturers may not adopt computation modeling because you have a two-tier system, and it's not worth the expense of the time to actually do the computation modeling if you don't have to do it for other territories. Which is why it's really important that an international regulatory framework, internationally accepted standards do exist. Now, within the EU, although we don't have a specific MDCG guidance on computation modeling, we do have it within the framework. And although at the moment EU notified bodies will be working in silos, there is still the framework, the foundation on which that can be built. So in summary, computation modeling, especially within the regulatory manufacturer side, is kind of the lag phase of adoption, and it is going to take time, but in time, with experience, things will change. I have touched upon the ethical considerations. There are a lot deeper, but we do not have time, unfortunately, to be able to go into a deep dive. A benefit versus risk approach must be taken, and any data that is submitted must be based on an evidence-based approach, a weight-based approach. An alignment of regulatory territories is really important with their need for international standards. But there is a potential here for computation modeling, not only in the pre-market medical device development, but also perhaps in the post-market monitoring as well. Thank you very much. I think that's my 15 minutes.
That was perfect in time. I mean, as the other two too. So thank you so much, Suraj. I think we will get to the questions later. Thank you. Yeah, and now I would like to introduce Gavin. Gavin is going to talk about, oh, sorry. Oh, Gavin, I lost the title. Gavin, I just hand over to you, please. I'm sorry. Can you also, yeah, here. I will hand over to you. Sorry for that.
Find myself as well.
We can hear you and we can see your slides.
Okay. Well, you don't need to see me. That's probably better anyway. So I'm Gavin Quigley. I am one of BSI's internal clinicians. My background, like Suraj's, is as a neurosurgeon in the UK. We're not all leaving neurosurgery in the UK, just to be clear. It just happens to be a bit of a quirk today that you've got 2 ex-neurosurgeons. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the use cases that we might think about for submissions. And Renee and I are going to overlap a little bit because we're going to talk about similar things, but I'm going to focus really on what we might see as the more obvious use cases. And that might be where we have rare or extreme sizes. And that mainly relates to implants. And largely that's going to be our orthopedic implants. And if we think about hips and knees, which are obviously common high volume replacements, those are things that we, are used every day of the week in every country in the world, pretty much. And we know a lot about them. But what we do sometimes struggle with, I think, both from the notified body perspective and the regulatory side, but also from submissions, is when you have these really unusual sizes. So if you have very large or very small sizes, it's a real challenge to get data. And you're not going to get it because they're used so infrequently. So you're in this catch-22 situation where you know you need to use these sizes because they're used on occasion, but there's a real lack of evidence and a real lack of ability to gather further evidence because they are so infrequently used. And to do that in the long term, it's just impractical. And I think we in the notified bodies understand some of those challenges, particularly those of us who come from a clinical background. But there is still this regulatory requirement and framework that we've talked about that we all have to work within. We can't ignore the regulatory framework. We can be pragmatic as best we can be, but we still have to have something to document, to prove to our auditors, because of course the notified bodies get audited on a pretty regular basis, that we're looking at the regulations and that we're interpreting them in a sensible way. And I think some of the advantages here for In-Silico are that this is potentially a way that we can bridge some of this evidence gap. And if you think about just hips, for example, and again, I am not an orthopedic surgeon, but my very basic understanding, if you like, is that when you have very large patients with high BMIs, you might require custom, unusual stems, you might need different cups. You find that these replacements are used very low numbers. Prospective studies just not feasible, and you're never going to get that data because it's never going to meet your your statistical calculation for a power. It's just not going to happen. So we have to think about it. We might be able to use things like computational fluid dynamics, perhaps in cement, where it's going to end up. If we've got poor bone quality, we might need cement. We might use a fluid dynamic model to work out what's going to happen to cement. And we also might use finite element analysis models to simulate that load distribution and how stable it's going to be. And we might then be able to help justify this mechanical safety under these maximum load conditions. So that I think is one interesting idea that we might be able to consider. And I think if we extend it, and again, Renee's going to talk a little bit more about this, but trauma plates are used again worldwide. They're as common as anything. You come to summertime in any country in the world and you will have fractures of wrists, elbows, whatever else, skateboards, and you name it, kids fall off them, trees. And so these are used widely, and they're absolutely essential. because they allow for accurate reconstruction. You want to, all you really need for these kids is to fix it, get it lined up properly, and they will heal quickly. And that's what we want. We want them moved on. We do not want, and we want to be able to use these devices that we know a lot about and we understand the safety of. You can pretty much work out what's going to happen. There's clinical data on the adult ones. You can work out the forces, the stiffness, the fatigue. You can then use some of the things that Marta and Erica have touched on, which are virtual populations. So you may be able to create these virtual populations and say, well, look, we can model what's likely to happen to these small sizes. And the potential here is to support extensions of adult designs into these smaller sizes, because we know from adults that they work. They're really very simple. You know, these are screws and plates. We use them every day in everything else, in our kitchens, in our living rooms. You know, there's nothing revolutionary about the concept. What we have to come across is that regulatory burden and that evidence gathering. The other thing then that we can probably demonstrate with in-silico modeling and computational models are that we can simulate these extreme physiological loads. So we can use worst case scenarios, unusual angles, poor bone quality, high wear scenarios. And that might be useful for these rare combinations where you have unusual anatomy and unusual implants that, again, you're very unlikely to ever be able to collect any significant amounts of clinical data. And I think our focus and the competent authority focus is this margin of safety under all conditions. You know, that's a basic principle of benefit risk, is that you've got this margin for as much of the population you're likely to use the device in. You know, we always think about the normal distribution curve, but what we want to do is try and widen that as far as we reasonably can, so that we've got good evidence and reassurance that we're able to, you know, have this margin of safety under all these unusual conditions. And in-silico lends itself to that. So how do we align? Well, we've heard about this a lot. The MV40, or in theory an equivalent, although this is the most widely used one, to justify the credibility of the model that we're submitting. We need to be able to demonstrate the inputs that reflect real world data, so bone density, loading, things that we understand in the clinical world. Have we got population variability? Have we got a sensitivity analysis? And have we, obviously, uncertainty quantification can be done in lots of ways, but we need to have a sensible way of describing it to our notified bodies and our regulatory authorities, because there will always be some uncertainty. And that is true of any clinical study or data that you submit. There is always a degree of uncertainty because there are limitations, just as there are in the best, you know, randomized controlled trials in the world. As Alex will always tell you, randomized controlled trials are great for answering a single scientific question, but they do very little to tell you what happens to a device in the real world. And I think that, you know, these are the things that we need to be thinking about as clinicians, as academics, as, you know, from the patient's perspective and from the regulatory. We want to be able to, you know, look at this sort of data and say, well, what does it tell us and where can we use it? What can it help us with? And I think the important thing from the regulatory side is that if you're going to use this sort of evidence, you need to be able to explain where it complements your clinical data, even if that clinical data is very limited. I think that's the other thing that we would say. So if you're going to sort of go along this route, I think you need to perhaps consider what you're using it for. So this might be new sizes, line extensions, as we would typically refer to them. You need to be able to link that modeling to the performance that you already know from your standard sizes. The 80% of your, you know, volume will be across a range of standard sizes. You need to cross-reference any bench testing that you've done, any preclinical. You need to be able to say that you've got some retrospective data. We need some clinical data. And you should link this traceability to the general safety and performance requirements. So in the CER, there should be a clear link. And I mean, that's true of all devices anyway. There should be this clear link to show us, you know, that you're meeting these standards. Your in-silico models can definitely de-risk some of the regulatory submissions for rare devices, because often we have virtually no data to go on. We've got some historic data, we've got some estimates, we've got some retrospective stuff, we've got maybe a few cases from some of the large registries. So if we can get credible, reproducible models that are relevant, that, I think for me anyway, that has to be a step forward. Now, I'm talking, if you like, from a sort of academic clinician perspective here. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that BSI will turn around and accept all of your device submissions as in silico models at the minute. And please don't think that that's what I'm saying. But if you want to do this sort of thing, it is really important that you engage with your contacts in the notified body and explain what it is you're trying to do. And I think with the improvement in the advice we've been given in terms of you know, structured dialogue, this is definitely the sort of thing that I see us being able to discuss about whether it's suitable, whether it's credible, and whether it can be, you know, in the mix. Because to me, this is not giving consulting advice. This is very much saying, what's evidence is available? What can we do with it? The really important thing, again, is to document everything. Document the rationale. What are the assumptions? What are the limitations? We will always expect, you know, this robust model and this justification to be made. And if you simplify and idealize, they need to be risk assessed. And the outcomes should support, but not overstate clinical claims. I think that's really the most important bit in this slide. And it's really important that you articulate whatever the boundaries and the limitations are, so that, you know, we've got that to look at. Just again, just to bring you back to the real world and the tedious notified body stuff, post-market clinical follow-up, this is becoming increasingly our focus, and I think focus of most of the competent authorities. We are being asked, how are we looking at post-market surveillance plans, post-market clinical follow-up plans? So that will inevitably then fall downhill towards the manufacturers, and we will start to ask more and more questions as more and more devices are certified about post-market follow-up. The really important thing is that post-market is a continuous process, that it's being adapted, things are being learnt, and the plans are being updated. And if you can do that and demonstrate you're doing that after you're in silico, you know, again, this is something I see that fits into the existing framework. I don't think we need anything, you know, new or revolutionary in terms of the framework. We can support life cycle, we can look at ongoing validation within the clinical use, and we will inevitably learn things as we go along. But you must have that post-market clinical follow-up. Now, whether that's going to be your registry data for the orthopedic, some survey data, or, you know, case series, but an acknowledgement that you're going to try and track these unusual sizes if that is what you're submitting. And I think finally, just a very last slide, just to say, look, this is the way I think about the risk management and the NV40. And this is where I see them kind of similarities, if you like, that you can see that, you know, the documentation for the ISO standard is, you know, risk management file. But in VNV40, you've got this model credibility assessment plan in your report. And all of these documents need to go into technical files. So that really is just the way I like to think about the similarities and the link between your normal, you know, medical device risk assessment, which is 14971, and VNV40. And I will probably just leave it there and hand over to Renee.
Thank you, Gavin. That was great. Yeah. And then, yeah, that leaves the last presentation for myself. I hope everybody can see my screen now. Okay, good. So to myself, I'm René Bombin. I'm director of clinical director at UK CEiRSI. And today I would like to talk about the clinical data in very small patient populations due to rare diseases, and with a specific view on orphan devices. Yeah, I think everybody talks about orphan devices a lot. We hear things. We have an MDCG guidance that has been recently published end of last year. And orphan devices has always been a regulatory challenge. I mean, I think the devices are usually intended. I mean, even the devices we had before the orphan device guidance was published, and also even before the MDR was in place, there had been always devices for rare diseases, for so-called orphan diseases, which are often life-threatening or chronically debilitating conditions. Most of the difficulties we used to have, I mean, I also used to work 11.5 years for Toulouse as a clinical reviewer. What we saw with high-risk devices, I mean, usually we saw high-risk devices in these rare diseases. And I mean, they're class 3, they're implants, they're close to the central nervous or central circulatory system, so they carry a certain risk. So that means it's not only a regulatory challenge. I saw this really as the regulatory challenge back in the days, because we saw the need for the people, for the patients to receive treatment. With the MDCG guidance 2024-10, we have now a guidance document on hand supporting the MDR that defines actually what orphan diseases are. This is actually what happens in less than 12,000 patients per year in the EU. Orphan diseases, we have usually a lack of alternative treatments in these patients. Looking back of what the MDR actually says about the sufficient clinical evidence for devices as it is written in Article 61, it says actually that you need for every device sufficient clinical evidence. However, as you see in the second part of this Article 61, that the manufacturer shall specify and justify the level of evidence that is actually necessary to demonstrate that. However, if we have, as we said before, a high-risk device, so class 3 device, an implant, we have actually severe limitations to fulfill Article 61. Now, under the MDR for new devices, the recruitment of patients for studies is basically not possible because we have only a few patients that might be treated in a year. And we have actually no clinical evidence. For legacy devices, the issue is if you want, or also the transfer from the directives to the MDR with legacy devices used to be, in some cases, difficult. I mean, even if we had the 61(6)(b) article, but it is still unpractical and unethical to start now clinical trials if the device is on the market since decades. So that leaves manufacturers to the issue and also notified bodies to the issue that you have devices that are actually needed on the market, but you have no possibility to generate the appropriate clinical data. There's actually also no legal wording in the MDR that governs that in a certain way to say, okay, we can have, a certain amount of clinical data. Now it is basically the MDR is written for all devices at the same level of evidence. The MDCG guidance, as everybody knows, is not legally binding since it's not a legal document. I mean, it's not the law. It's a guidance document, and we actually don't have at large scale something that is already implemented in the FDA. I mean, where you have actually these humanitarian device exemptions. We don't have this in Europe yet. But what is important? So if we look at orphan devices, I think it is important to think about what is actually possible to accept and where can computational modeling and simulation play a role. In this MDCG guidance 2024-10, it says actually that there are different clinical data available, right? You have your clinical data that you actually get out of clinical trials. You have preclinical data. This is considered all bench testing, animal testing, similar to the things that Suraj also mentioned. But there's a new definition in this MDCG guidance, and this speaks about non-clinical data. These non-clinical data, they shall play a supportive role in establishing safety, performance, and benefit risk profile. It's not similar to clinical data in the traditional sense, but these non-clinical data may have a greater role. So that means you have limitations for your clinical data, but there's a possibility actually to produce high quality non-clinical data. And that means if you can produce non-clinical data based on computational modeling and simulation, this can in the end, over time, also reduce the burden for pre-marked clinical data to justify the CE marking. One example, I like to show that example is actually one of, I mean, it's actually from cardiac surgery. It's for children that are required to receive a Fontan surgery. So children with a univentricular heart, where the surgeon actually have to reconstruct the possibility of blood flow into the heart, into the right heart, into the lungs. And I mean, up to now, I mean, it's more like, okay, you have to, out of experience, to guess the best way to actually create this conduit. I mean, this artificial backflow into the lung arteries and back into the lungs, but you don't have a ventricle. So that means the patient is under anesthesia. I mean, you only can guess. You don't have the real physiological conditions as you would have if the patient, the child in this scenario, is actually awake. So that means this operation might go also with reoperations, or you might not have the right size. But with this, this is a technology based on computational modeling and simulation presented by Dr. Hoganson from the Children's Hospital in Boston. They actually created, based on imaging, MRI data and catheterization data, a simulation, what size you should use as a conduit. I mean, here you see different scenarios, how you can model actually the conduit for the backflow of the venous blood to the lungs. And here you can actually see the pressures that can be simulated. So that means, and this is actually already in use. They treated, I think the last, what I know is, I think they have over 1,000 patients, small patients treated that way. So that means they could do pre-planning, and then actually during the surgery, having the right sizes used for that surgery. So I think that's a very good example, because Fontan surgery is also not such a, it's not happening that often. That means computational modeling and simulation. This is a pivot for clinical data. So we have to define in orphan diseases the way we look at clinical data. We need, for sure, I mean, if we have clinical data, we need clinical data for the clinical benefit, as is required by MDR Article 2, Definition 53, that has to have a positive impact. The device has to have a positive impact on patient health. For orphan devices, here also the context matters. I mean, even if you have a modest benefit, this can be meaningful. Then regarding the risk, I mean, we have to consider the risk. I mean, if it's orphan device or not, so there is potential negative effects, known or theoretical, and it has to fulfill Annex 1, the GSPRs, but also ISO 4971. And with computational modeling and simulation, or the clinical data strategy here, there's a possibility of analyzing benefit and risk, and also recognizing performance data and safety data in one. With computational modeling and simulation, I mean, without having any data, it is difficult to know what is actually enough if you look at data that you need. with computational modeling and simulation. I mean, with the right context of use, with the right question of interest. I mean, you could actually simulate the data that can be enough to actually support conformity assessment process to meet the required acceptance criteria. I mean, notified bodies need these acceptance criteria because it's written in Annex 14 Part A in order to actually then also approve and see that the safety and performance of the benefit is met. The models that we have for with computational modeling and simulation, they are flexible. So they are, I mean, if we have a child, I mean, we can adapt this to the anatomy of a child. I mean, it can be an adult, it can be also patients with specific anatomical, also physiological or pathophysiological conditions. So that means here's more the emphasis on the contextual benefit. And I mean, I think we also have to move away from the statistical superiority, because this is nothing that we actually have to drive for orphan devices. One thing that actually happened already, I mean, everybody's talking about real world data, so we have usually a huge, I mean, there is a more variety of data than only the clinical trial data that we know. Let's call it the totality of evidence, right? And this should be something that we also have to take into account for orphan devices. So not only looking, is there a clinical trial that is powered with enough patients in order to statistically significantly reach acceptance criteria. It is more, we have limited clinical data, for example, from compassionate use cases. We might have clinical data from off-label use that might be used in this context. We do have preclinical bench testing data, and we might have clinical data from, for example, scientific literature from analogous devices. And this is already something that we already know, and it's written in MBCG Guidance 2020-6 in Appendix 3, where we actually see, I mean, this is more for the well-established technology, so devices has been already certified under the directives, now being transferred into the MDR, also newly certified under the MDR. They are differently managed. And here, if you can see, I mean, this is the evidence levels, and maybe you know also this this table from the Appendix 3, but it takes actually into account a lot of data sources. So equivalency data, then evaluation of state-of-the-art data from similar devices, or in 7 complaints and vigilance data, proactive post-market surveillance data from surveys, for example. Individual case reports. I mean, usually when you do like submissions back in the days, everybody was saying no case reports, because that's not enough evidence. But it is actually one part of the puzzle that can be used in certain circumstances for safety, for example. Then compliance to non-clinical elements of common specifications, if we do have any common specifications. Then here, simulated use testing, right? And I mean, here we are already. And then, of course, preclinical and bench testing. But that means there is already a body of evidence, and if used to feed the model in the correct way, it will also give some good output. I think also in that way, the impact of all these totality of evidence, so the real world data that we actually can gather also for devices with small patient groups, physicians, patients, and ethic boards might then also accept reasonable evidence. So if there's no alternative, then there's a possibility that reasonable evidence can also be weighed much higher. Because enrollment in studies, as I said earlier, would take years. I mean, if ever being completed. It is actually about filling the unknown or the gaps with validated CM&S simulations. And CM&S gives also regulators specific data to accept life-saving options faster. We heard this earlier, that actually there is something about, it's not always, but of course it's always about the risk. But I mean, what can we do in order to de-risk the approval? I mean, this could happen actually also through computational modeling and simulation, and in the context of post-market clinical follow-up. So I think everybody knows accelerated testing, bench testing, accelerated aging. I mean, this is already established for many years, since many years. With computational modeling and simulation, this could also be used to extrapolate this accelerated clinical data aging. So, I mean, if you don't have this, I mean, for a class 3 implant for an orphan disease in a child, you don't have the possibility to wait 5 or 10 years in order to see if this device will work. Here, computational modeling could also help to generate data, I mean, looking, you know, how the device could change if the child grows, so if the anatomy changes, if the physiology might change. I think that was also something that Marta mentioned earlier. In order to generate, or in order also to see or predict the potential changes, you could do best case or worst case scenarios. And I mean, if you also put this in the dependence of time, you could also see how the device might also behave over time on the market, and specifically for orphan diseases where children are in need. I mean, there will be the change much bigger than if you might implant something into an adult patient. So there might be a much bigger, worst case scenario in children because they grow. And then post-market clinical follow-up, as we said earlier, must be done. I mean, there's actually no possibility to not do post-market clinical follow-up, but post-market clinical follow-up and orphan devices here can also use to address the gaps from these limited pre-market data, right, in order to support the GSPRs. Examples here would be like a prospective observational study as a post-market clinical follow-up study, actually, that all treated patients go into the study, their tailored visits and surveillance time to support estimated acceptance, because you have the estimated acceptance levels before, you know, with all this totality of evidence that you have, in order to support then maybe also these evidence levels when you do your prospective observational study. Real-world device usage registry with focus on trends. I mean, as with regard to Article 88, this is also something that has been already in use for many years. I mean, registries are like, there's a lot of registries out there, but we also have to be careful what type of data we're going to use if we look at registries. Because also registries must be compliant with regulatory data collection and also see if they really reflect the data that we actually also need for our device. Yeah, support from the inside out. I was thinking, you know, why is computational modeling and simulation so important? I mean, it's not that long that I actually came to computational modeling and simulation, as I said earlier. So for 13 years, I actually looked at clinical investigation plans, and I saw basically all the time that the amount of clinical data for clinical studies is usually never enough. I mean, it doesn't, because there are a lot of constraints. I mean, that manufacturers are bound to, that, I mean, that maybe also patient groups are bound to. And even if we do have MDR Article 71 that actually says that member states should check the clinical investigation plans also with regard to if the data can then meet the required endpoints, and there should be no gaps. But in the conformity assessment process, most studies are still underpowered. And I mean, there are different reasons. And I mean, also specifically for situations like orphan devices. I mean, the time to follow up, I mean, especially for long-term implants, I mean, that's basically not possible. Then availability of patients, right? I mean, for orphan devices, we discussed that. Then the risk to patients. So, I mean, I think Gavin said that before, or I think CEiRSI said this, I mean, like you use something on patients where you're not really aware of the risk profile. Scientific knowledge might be an issue, and also the financial pressure. And situation is devastating most of the time, but even worse for orphan devices. And this is why I see this computational modeling and simulation as a bridge between science and regulations, coming back to the title of this webinar, actually, right? Being the enabler, the glue between this, right? So you can actually, with CM&S, it's a tool, you can simulate device behavior in patient-specific anatomical or physiological conditions, as we said. You can predict benefits, hopefully performance and safety, and also failure scenarios in silico. And I think also this, since up to now, it is not allowed yet to completely replace human clinical trial data with in silico evidence. However, this totality of evidence I think that's a good concept in order to have specific aspects supporting the data that we have with validated models in CM&S. And also CM&S aligns actually with MDR expectations, coming back to what Suraj said, recognize the existence of data from computer modeling here in Annex 7, 4.5.4. And Annex 7 also requires actually the expertise of a notified body to validate these data. Yeah, so CM&S should help scientific innovation to meet regulatory confidence. And I think that's also the same that Erika also mentioned. I think it is, or it should become a shared language between scientists who want to explore and innovate and regulators who need reproducibility, traceability, and risk management in order to, to actually, in the end, check the box and say that the device is safe and performs as intended according to the MDR. And the key success factors here is early regulatory engagement. I mean, I think that's also what Erika and Marta also said. You know, we need a robust model validation, integrate evidence strategies. And I think we also see this in our airlock sessions that we do. Sometimes we also need multiple models. I think it's not only enough to look at one point. Sometimes you have to look at the broader picture. So conclusion here, computational modeling and simulation shall not be considered a shortcut around regulation. It shall allow to merge multiple clinical and non-clinical data into a validated model. And it is a valid scientific-driven method to generate evidence where no other methods can. And especially for orphan devices, where the urgency and ethics constraints our evidence options, CM&S allows to produce clinical data in the absence of statistically significant real-world data, predict clinical outcomes, and provide a contextual clinical data, predicting patient benefit and patient risk over time. And it's only one pillar for the justification in orphan devices to fulfill Article MDR 61, but it makes it acceptable to have less data, that the benefits is, and if the benefit is meaningful and the risk is managed. It combines surrogate endpoints, and orphan devices cannot be held to the same clinical evidence standards as common use devices. I think this is clear to all of us. CM&S enables a rational regulatory pathway, but a robust PMCF plan is not optional, it's essential. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening. Now, you know how I stop sharing? Did I stop sharing already? No, I didn't. How do I stop sharing? Here. Good. So then I think we can now maybe, so thank you all for your great contribution here with your presentations. And I think now we should look into the questions that are actually posed already. Shall we just go one by one, or Alex, how would you like us to do that?
Yeah, I think we could start with the ones. There's quite a few on the chat, but I also would like to emphasize that if anybody else wants more impromptu sort of asking a question, you can let us know through the Q&A, and then we can give you audio as well to connect. So do you want me to help, Renee, by sort of putting it to all of you as a panel? The questions there. So there was the first question, I think it's more like a common question, and I think it relates to the importance of training and raising awareness. Would it be helpful to have a basic introduction to regulatory affairs requirements to these researchers? I suppose they mean modeling and simulation people, as part of their academic training, so that advances in silico trials will reach the patients.
Can try a first answer if
Yep.
Yeah, I think for PhD students that would definitely be very relevant. And at IC Health we had a workshop a few weeks ago, early June, about this aspect, and we did the informal anecdotal survey, and not one PhD student in the room knew what a notified body was. So I think that perfectly illustrated the lack of awareness, which is perfectly normal, but definitely an action point for the future, and to help that transition little by little to raise awareness and bring the principles there, so that they can eventually integrate the principles in their work.
Yes, if you allow me, I can complement what Erika mentioned. A few weeks ago, I've been attending a conference on from IEEE of soft robotic, and I was talking about the confluence of the integration between soft robotics and computational modeling and simulation. But what caught me my attention was that many of PhD are really genius people. They do fantastic soft robotics developments, very good prototypes, very good ideas that you can say, wow, blows your mind with all these ideas, but they don't have idea of how to put a product into the market. So the best way to put a product into the market is, of course, to do to partner with regulatory affairs specialists that can help to make a regulatory plan to establish what are the standards that are applicable to that new device, right? And to establish the strategy in order to put that eventually that device into the market. Without the regulatory path, those brilliant ideas will be just brilliant ideas. So definitely, I agree with Erika that the training, even during the PhD degrees, will be fantastic for them. Yeah.
Any other comments, Suresh?
Yeah, sorry, could I also add, I think clinicians are also an important part of all of this. You know, when I was a clinician, I used to get very frustrated when I was a PI on various trials, and I recruited to many other trials, was a lack of being able to recruit patients into them. And I think, you know, clinicians are the driving factors within hospital institutions. And, you know, I'd have loved to have known then what I know now about medical device regulations. So I do think, you know, also educating clinicians in terms of what In-Silico can do in terms of helping them develop their ways to treat patients into the medical device for use, I think that's really important. So I completely agree. I think that's before 360 improvement in education in terms of what In-Silico can offer and what can be done to help patients.
And I think, Suresh, in line of what you're answering, I would dare to extend that this is probably in general for regulatory affairs experts as well, to understand what, you know, the space of the possible and what is science fiction with modeling and simulation will equally, you know, be relevant. So that's a great point. And just to put a little plug there, we are within the context of the UK CEiRSI, we have a strand of work around workforce development and skills development. So if anybody here in the audience is particularly interested in that, you know, you're welcome to reach us. Lara will put my email as well and other contact details. But we are actually quite keen to help working with, you know, regulatory affairs organizations and modeling and simulation organizations to look at what is a curriculum that needs to be built to bridge between these two. So I'll move on to the next one. So there is a question by Letao Lee and around, and Letao, you have a few questions. So I will ask kindly to Lara to give you the chance to join in via voice if you want to add anything at some point. But I think you're making a point that unlike medical devices where we have ASME BMB40 as a standard, there seems to be no similar standard for pharmaceuticals, and that there are different other methods that are used in that domain, like POP-PK, population PK, PBPK, QSP, ML, and AI, that are used for modeling and simulation. And the question is whether we should build a specific standards for each of the model methods, so we could develop some sort of generic standards for credibility assessment. So who would like to take the one on?
If you allow me, I can
Yeah.
answer this question quickly, and somebody can complement if you like.
Yeah, of course, go for it, Marta.
Yes. Yes, I was thinking about that question when who if is anonymous? No, it's Letaodi who formulated. So I can tell you that the ASME BM40 was originally developed to assess the credibility of computational models used in the context of medical devices. But the standard is considered general enough to be applied to other disciplines, including pharmaceutical products. Among key points that I can highlight is that as a primary scope, the ASME BM40 provides a really nice framework to evaluate the credibility of CM&S based on the risk associated with the decision the model supports. That can be applicable to medical devices, but as well beyond medical devices, although its initial focus is medical devices, as we can see a lot in the literature. There are manufacturers of immunotherapies that are using BM40 as a model, and explicitly notes that the framework is generalizable and can be applied in other fields than in pharma, or pharma development. FDA has referenced ASME BM40 in context beyond devices, including discussions about continuous manufacturing and model-informed drug development, suggesting its principles are relevant for pharmaceutical applications as well. So in pharmaceutical modeling, such as pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamics, PK, PD, drug dissolution, or continuous manufacturing, the BM40 framework certainly may help you. You may justify the use of in-silico models in regulatory submission. You may need to structure the documentation of model validation and verification activities, and you may communicate model credibility to the regulators and the stakeholders. So if you are considering applying BM40 in a pharma context, for instance, I would recommend or advise to adapt the frameworks thoughtfully, aligning it with the domain-specific standards. For example, ICH M12, EMA, FDA guidance on modeling informed drug development. I hope that helped.
Super, that's really helpful, Marta. And I need to say there are out there already efforts to adapt essentially the ASME BM40 for the pharmaceutical domain. So it's not completely true that those don't exist for that area. There is actually some consultation open at the moment by EMA about ways in which they can develop credibility standards as well in similar area. And there is similarly also standards or at least guidelines from things like the Equator Network that are associated to how to interpret or establish credibility for AI predictive models as well. So and interesting, many of the things are converging into risk assessed frameworks, as you were saying. Super. So anybody else that wants to add something before we go to the next question? Okay, so the next question is anonymous and is about a point is made, which I think is fair, that there is actually lots of noises from a number of regulators about the fact that they are open to receive in-silico evidence. There is some guidelines like the FDA ones, but it seems like there is a lack of praxis, right? So the theory is out there, but there is a lack of praxis, and in particular, details about how exactly you fill in forms and you sort of you sort of provide this evidence. I need to say before passing the word that there is also some guidance from FDA about how to report credibility and how to report modeling results. That's the person who asked the question may want to have a look at. Anybody that wants to take that question and sort of
I will try to take a little piece of it if this is okay. I think one of the questions, or the lower part of this question, if it would be helpful to showcase less complex scenarios. I think this would be actually very helpful. I mean, at RUPS, I mean, they were presenting data, or they were presenting devices, I mean, where they don't have any data because nobody's working with those. I mean, I think everybody knows like these insufflators for laparoscopic surgery, where you actually have to insufflate CO2 into the abdomen in order to work there. So I mean, this could be like, I mean, we talked about this, that this might be a possibility actually to have like an easy setup. I mean, where you can actually model something that is more or less straightforward. I mean, and not starting with a heart valve, for example, because there's so many different things that you have to consider if you're looking into a transcatheter aortic valve replacement. So there's so many things. So I think it would be, as you said, I think it would be good to start with a simple device, generate the data, because there's also the need for data in order to support safety and performance. But I think that would be a good approach, because going more complex might also lead to more confusion. So I'm definitely into this, right? Showcase like easy models in order to also demonstrate to regulators that this is a way forward.
That's great. Thanks so much. So yeah, Suresh,
I just want to add, I think the difficulty here is you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And it'd be great to have examples, but I've orphan devices, but until you actually start having applications, it's difficult to then be able to give examples, of course. And obviously the American system is already set up and it's not necessarily directly comparable. What I would say, echoing what Gavin had said before, is start by having structured dialogues with your notified body. I try to explain the fact that in my talk in particular, that you use it to start with. It's not going to be a complete replacement for clinical trials at this stage. We are far from that point. In my opinion, this is just my opinion, is that it's a weight of evidence approach, which means that you use it as an adjunct to your clinical trials to help support the data that you're doing. Now, we already know that it's there for bench testing, but it can be used to supplement. And I think that's how you start. You start by your conversations, you start by using it as an adjunct in a weight of evidence approach, and then we'll be able to talk about giving examples. But the difficulty is we've got to start somewhere.
Absolutely. And Suraj, this is also just to add, is a bit what we are trying to do in the CEiRSI with the case studies and the pilots. Is like it's a non-competitive or a pre-competitive collaborative case examples that they are not technically regulatory, they don't lead to any particular constraint or commitment by anybody, but at least it helps everybody to understand the complexity of weighting the different sources, right? Which I suspect is the same in conventional trials. It's just that we've been doing that for so many years that we have an intuition that has been developed, which is what we're trying now to speed up in the case of in-silico methods, right? Yeah. Super. And now that I have you, Suraj, there, maybe you want to help answering this one on where does the UK sit between the US, the EU and the US on the use of modeling and simulation? If that's something you were having.
I suspect you may know more about the UK, Alex, than me. I mean, I am Cunha, please correct if I'm wrong, you'll probably know more. It's that, the MHRA, just like the EU, do recognise the fact that in-silico is going to be part of the future. And I'm aware that the MHRA are saying, especially manufacturers speak with, your scientific committees. But Alex, you may know more about any further developments, do you? Sorry, I'm not terribly in favour of the UK changes.
Yeah, I could add a couple of things, but maybe Gavin as well. So basically is what you said. So MHRA, what he's saying is the law, and by the way, there is some presentations out there that I could point to the person who asked the question if you're interested in. But there is a particular webinar that we made in April last year together with in NAFEMS, together with colleagues from MHRA. And in that webinar, and in every subsequent conversation, the position of MHRA seems to be that they are open to in-silico evidence. Is a bit like what you were saying, Suraj, before, there is a praxis that needs to be developed. Therefore, it's a lot more of a conversational process at the moment than perhaps everybody would want, but it's the way to start. And the point is, there is nothing in the law that prevents you for providing in silico evidence. The only thing you need to do, according to the law, is to prove safety and efficacy of your product through whatever credible means you can, right? And the advice as well has been that don't try to look into this as a way to replace randomized controlled trials, but actually use them as a way to help designing better the trials, justify your assumptions in your design, maybe justify why you are looking or not looking into specific, possible subgroups of patients. So ways that actually give you more confidence to the design of a trial and reduce the likelihood of that trial to be a failed one, so to say. Anybody else that wants to add to that? I mean, Gavin, you've been also in quite a few discussions.
No, I think all of those things are absolutely true. I think the UK is certainly looking, and the MHRA have an awareness of in silico methods, and they are key to try and develop those in combination with their sort of overall view of aligning with current standards internationally. Alignment with Europe, alignment with the FDA, alignment, to try and make sure that they're not an outlier or more difficult. I think that they're very much looking at what makes sense and what can be perhaps advantageous to the UK generally, with, if you like, less restrictive regime. So there may well be opportunities going forward. I mean, it remains to be seen what the actual legislative text will be. At the minute, we're still pretty much based on the old MDD. So I think that's the important thing, that the UK CA is currently based on the old MDD, the Medical Device Directive. And those are the requirements you need to fulfill for UK CA. So, there may be opportunities going forward for manufacturers, I think, to look at those sorts of things. And the MHRA are keen to promote, and indeed our partners in the CEiRSI. I think that's the other thing to say. They're very much involved in the CEiRSI at the moment. But things are still very much in development. I think it's probably fair to say, Alex, wouldn't you? You're mute.
Yes, indeed. Exactly, Gavin. And that's in part why we're doing these events, right? It's also to grow that community that can help to develop, because as you can see, there is lots of work to do. And we can, is a bit of a community effort, right? To build the trust, to build the methods, to build the process, and to recognize regulatory science as a science as much as, any of the other disciplines there are. So I'm going to go to the next question, if you are okay with that, also by Letao, and this is an interesting one. So he's asking, if we think about models now, not in terms of the mechanistic models of disease or the mechanistic models of a device interaction with the host body, but we look at the populations themselves as a model, right? On what level we could trust them, and how much information we could use to replace the real patients. Since in theory, you can simulate thousands of virtual patients and extreme situations, but how to complement but not bias reality results. Anybody who wants to take that one? And Letao, while I give my colleagues a bit of opportunity to think through a bit your question, there is one of the pilots that is actually coming in a couple of weeks, and some of the colleagues here are involved, Renee is involved, and others, is about virtual populations and how we do credibility assessment of those. So if you want to drop us an email, we'll make sure that we connect you with that group, but they're studying specifically that question.
Yeah, I think one thing that needs to be always considered, I mean, it is an estimation. I mean, we don't know, right? I mean, the basis for the virtual population is actually something that we would like to extrapolate. So real clinical data we have, and then seeing where it might lead. But I mean, it is never, we don't know. And this is why what we said also before, a PMCF is important, so that if you treat people, I mean, of course you have to consider the risk, but if you treat the people, then you have to see if actually the estimations that you have with regard to outcome parameters, if they might also, or if they are met then in the end. So again, I mean, you never get like a confirmation that it is the right way to go with this virtual population. So you always have to be cautious. But I mean, there's the same that you need to do actually also with the real clinical trial. I mean, if you have your very closed inclusion-exclusion criteria, you have a very idealized patient population even now in clinical trials. I mean, you don't even know if this might be the same, if you go then broad into real world data. I mean, you never know. So you always have to be careful and always have to see if your acceptance criteria in the end will match.
Anybody else who wants to add?
With respect to mitigation of bias, I think that there should be established a very clear process on validation of the data and also the tools that you use to validate the data in order to mitigate the should be part of the risk assessment process, right? So how to mitigate the bias, and this is part of the overall process of validation and verification as well. So as much data you have, there increases the chances that there can be a bias introduced in your model, and but if you have a good methodology with a strategy in order to mitigate the bias in your data, that has to be with data quality as well, and data curation, you will reduce that possibility.
Absolutely correct. So it's not only credibility of the computational model, but it's also the data that feeds and parameterizes those models, right?
Yeah, correct.
Particularly in that regard. I think, however, Letao probably also was referring, if I understood his question well, that that if you have the possibility to create, let's say, infinite, perfectly, valid models of the population, is there a risk that, for instance, you go with the testing across a uniform distribution and you tend to over bias, those extreme cases that now perhaps are less critical? And I suppose that in to some extent is less problematic, because if you improve a design, assuming that you don't necessarily incur in an unnecessary critical cost, over designing for robustness and safety is never a bad thing in itself, right? Okay, so we have only 3-4 minutes and a couple of questions that I'd like to get on. So it's great that you have put so many questions and so many insights, really, really helpful. The next one is actually quite interesting as one, again from Letao, and this is about if you use certain data, and I think comes back to the quality of the data again, right? So if you use certain data in preclinical testing, real measurements that you do, but then you use those measurements to inform your models for an in-silico trial, aren't you using the data twice, essentially, in your approval? And does this introduce some problem, right? In the sense that there is duplicate evidence or duplicate use of evidence.
Can I answer again?
Of course.
Well, I mentioned in my presentation about data sharing and data interoperability. And if you ever heard about the European healthcare database, ESDS, right? The whole purpose is to reuse the data. So if you have a database with in vitro, in vivo data that you may use for enhancing data with the new parameters or new information about comorbidities of patients that you want to restudy with the data that you already have in your database, why not? So that is not forbidden by the regulation. So actually in Europe, the ESDS is seeking to do that. So to reuse the data and even to contribute with with let's say by sharing the data with the EHDS, you can contribute with those small and medium companies that don't have access to the data, and they can use their own studies as well.
Any other comments? I'm thinking about as well, Renee and Sorash and Gavin, is there any other context where as consultants or as notified bodies, you have situations where there is some sort of dependency on different data sources or different evidence at different stages of the process, and to what extent that is an issue?
I think it's always important to tell the story right. I mean, and to put the data that you have into the right context. And if you have, if you have in-silico data, you have in vitro and in vivo data, if you put it into the right context, then and tell the story right, I think this should not be an issue. And I know that maybe Suresh and Gavin cannot really say something to that. So
yeah, I think from a notified body perspective, we tend not to see early stage data because we don't. That discussion, if you like, about clinical trials and early investigations happens with competent authorities, and that's out with our remit, if you like. So it's more difficult. I think if the question is though that if you're reusing a data set that you know or suspect may have issues, that is different. If you've built a virtual population to enhance, a particular group, and you realize later that there might be some issues with that, that's the sort of thing that we will be asking questions about if we recognize that. Now I think that's the difference. Again, this comes back to what Marta said about making sure that you validate and verify your data and that it is generally applicable. And that's true of any clinical trial. We will expect to see a group of patients, not just the one perfect patient.
Perfect. And we are nearly there. Just a last question by Pawan, who has been patiently waiting until the very end. And I think I have a bit of an insight into the question, Pawan being a colleague in our group. So his question is why basically certain medical devices that are meant to be used together, imagine, say, a neurovascular device and the delivery system, right? May have different risk labels. And is there a situation where, based on real world evidence, you may have to reclassify some of the devices from no trial needed to clinical trials required? And the question, I think, comes in the following context. We've been recently, the last few weeks, reading in our group a few papers that show that one of the largest sources of error in neurovascular devices is the problem of the devices not being released, or problems with the delivery system. So that's a case where the device itself is not the issue, although we do a trial about this, but actually the delivery system that we don't is becoming a problem. So is there any comment that you could make about this point?
Yeah, look, it's something we recognize. I think the way the system is set up is very much on a rules-based classification. That's the European way. And there's no perfect regulatory system. But you're right, it's the interaction between, you might find obviously your stent or your flow diverter is a class 3 implant. It's there for life. Whereas the electrical deployment device might technically be, 2A or something. But we tend to look at those things as an overall system and how they interact. And there are rules about how things interact with each other to deliver. So we will always ask about usability, about the deployment. So we won't necessarily change the risk class because that doesn't really determine. You still need to have clinical evidence. In theory, you still need to have that totality of evidence for a class 3 device. Now, we might expect longer safety data and performance data, but for your 2A simple drill bit, we will still expect largely some clinical evidence. And that evidence spectrum is there so that we can assign, that we can be sensible and say, okay, we know that works. But definitely for the sorts of devices you're talking about, the deployment devices which are critical to how stents and things are placed, we will expect to see usability testing. We'll expect to see, proper testing to show that those are reproducible. Because often, as everybody knows, in a randomized controlled trial, you've got one or two experts who do the surgery or the deployment, and they've been involved in the design, and they know exactly how to deploy it. And when you release it to the wild, that's when things start to go wrong. There's nothing inherently wrong with the device, but what there is that learning curve of how to deploy, how to get things in exactly the right place. And that is always difficult it's difficult in clinical trials, and it's hard for notified bodies to really, pick up that. How do we test for that? So we will always try and ask for those sorts of studies to show that manufacturers have thought about that. But I think it is, by and large, they're not bad at it. They put it as part of their risk assessment. It is there. They understand that.
Brilliant. So thanks a lot for answering all the questions posed to you. And I just want to say a big thanks to all of you. You've done a fantastic summary. It was great to go all the way from a sort of a mini introduction to in-silico trials by Marta, and what are some of the support structures that Erica provided. Then a brilliant introduction by Suresh, Gavin, and Renee about various aspects of the regulatory practice where this can fit, a lot of insights, and also by the honest answer to a lot of questions that eventually say that this is a great opportunity that we need to develop, but there's still a lot of work that we need to do to take things forward. But it's worth doing, and also recognizing that we are not starting from a status quo where everything is perfect. I keep reminding ourselves and others that we still have basically only 30% of the devices that go to testing being approved. 41% of the patients that participate in trials of medical devices will remain with investigational devices for the remaining of the lives. And in pharma, that's 5 out of 100 drugs that get approval, and 68% of the people who will be using drugs that will not become commercially available. So certainly there is a lot of space as well, a lot of work to do, but a lot of space to improving in the current practice. So with that, I'd like to say thanks and ask all of you to join the LinkedIn group that we have, where we normally publish all the upcoming events. And if Lara is around, do you want to briefly say when is the next event coming from our side, Lara?
Yep. So our next event is taking place tomorrow from 2 to 4 BST, and that is an airlock panel session on the enhancing regulatory data with In-Silico insights, and it'll be a case study in total knee replacement devices. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much and have a great day.